Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.41, David and Solomon, Modern Debates. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I said that modern archaeology had cast doubt on the biblical account of David and Solomon. This is a raging debate, the great central controversy of biblical archaeology today. Let's start with some questions about David that the biblical account itself raises. David starts his independent career as an outlaw in the Badlands, a rebel from his master, King Saul. David is closely associated with the Hebrews' southern coastal neighbours, the Philistines, sworn enemies of the Hebrews since the conquest of Canaan. He becomes a mercenary in their pay, albeit one who never attacks his own countrymen. After Saul's death, he spends years in a civil war convincing the northern tribes to accept him as king, a war concluded only by the death of his northern rival, Ishbosheth. In that war he leads his own Philistine and Aegean mercenaries, the Kerethites and Pelethites. You could easily interpret the biblical account like this. David was a southern Judean warlord, a defector from the northern Israelite strongman Saul. Backed up by mercenaries, he did not succeed Saul, but annexed Saul's territory after a short war following Saul's death. If you look a little deeper into the account in Kings, David is little more sophisticated a ruler than Saul was. David makes no treaties and conducts no trade. David's administration consists almost entirely of the army. In the Bible, David is often described in Hebrew as Saul is, as a negid, prince or leader, not a melech, a king. He is said to have suppressed the native Canaanite inhabitants of Jerusalem, but many of the names of his officials are Canaanite names, not Hebrew. And, as I discussed in episode 1.36, he may have replaced the highest levels of the Levitical priesthood with the Canaanite priests of Jerusalem. David is vividly portrayed in the Bible. The Bible quotes at length David's words to his wife, to Saul, to his best bud Jonathan, and to a host of others. David is a living human being. Solomon barely speaks a word to anyone except God and the Queen of Sheba. Solomon is a distant and imperious figure. We only see him through a curtain. Solomon's very name, Shlomo, is intriguing. It has no divine element like Yah or El in it, which would indicate his adherence to the God of Israel. Even the Bible found the name odd. In 2 Samuel 12, Solomon is named by the prophet Nathan as Jedediah, Yeriyahu, beloved of Yahweh. But that is the one and only time the name is used. It seems like a cursory editorial decision to give Solomon an Israelite name. Solomon's name seems to be more related to the name of the city of Jerusalem. One intriguing idea is that Solomon was a native chieftain of Jerusalem, whom later tradition called the son of David. According to the Bible, Solomon rules over a sophisticated and technologically advanced state. He builds mighty edifices. He maintains a sizable cavalry force and the latest in weaponry, chariots. Yet he relies entirely on the expertise and resources of the Phoenician king Hiram to build his temple and his palace. Solomon's temple is recorded as awash in gold, spices, silver, cedar, apes, peacocks, horses, mules, and ivory. Yet the archaeological record is unequivocal in showing a dearth, not an abundance, of foreign trade goods in the period. Solomon is wealthy beyond all measure, but he must sell 20 towns in Galilee to King Hiram to pay for the temple and palace. Simon is wisest of all rulers, but he so exploits and yokes his own people for his building projects that they revolt the moment he is dead, as we'll see later. Solomon is said to be a great conqueror, ruling the largest empire in the Middle East, but the Bible attributes to him no military campaigns. Solomon, the Bible says, is a mighty force on the international stage, yet he is beleaguered by the piddling kingdoms of Edom and Damascus. His name and his country appear nowhere in Egyptian or Mesopotamian records. For a country that the Bible says was the largest state in the Middle East, his kingdom has left no trace in the records of other nations. One thing that has struck many modern scholars is the fragility of the United Kingdom. Saul rarely went south of the borders of the northern tribes. The biblical account is clear that the northerners want nothing to do with David. The northerners are consistently depicted as weak-hearted failures. In Judges, only the tribes of Judah and Simeon succeed in conquering all the Canaanite enclaves. In the south, there were no Canaanites left, no Canaanite women to intermarry with. Since the northerners did not eliminate the Canaanites, they would be tempted again and again. In the first book of Kings, the 10 northern tribes are treated as little more than colonial subjects by Solomon. Judah is depicted as the stronger party. David's united kingdom lasts but 2 generations, perhaps 80 years, quite probably much less. Both David and Solomon faced significant opposition, and the very minute that Solomon dies, the northern tribes sunder from the southern ones. The kingdoms remain separate until their extinction centuries later. When the Jews returned from Babylon, they returned to the land of the southern kingdom, not the patrimony of the northern. The territory of the old northern kingdom would not be recaptured until the Maccabean kings of Judah retook it around 100 BC. In all the 900 years from David to that reconquest of the north, Judah and Israel were united for a tiny few decades. That does not sound like a united polity severed by civil war. That sounds more like 2 separate countries forcibly united by a single strongman. Think Yugoslavia and Marshal Tito. Until the 1980s, historians and archaeologists viewed the United Kingdom as a period for which the Bible provided a wealth of reliable information. The archaeology seemed to support the Bible's history. The obvious place to look for David and Solomon was Jerusalem, but the nature of the densely occupied city makes it difficult to excavate, and the Temple Mount is simply off limits. No one wants to be evicted, so that a crazy professor can dig their house up. Jerusalem is an enigma. So the search was diverted to Hatzor, Megiddo, and Giza, the great cities fortified by Solomon, at least according to Kings. Archaeologists dug there through the first half of the 20th century. At Megiddo they discovered a great layer of destruction, above the last layer containing Canaanite pottery. This must have been caused by David's conquest of the city. Above that they found substantial structures, the famed 6-chambered gates, as they did at the other sites. Some of these structures were identified as the renowned stables of Solomon. It was all turning out so well. The archaeology had confirmed the greatness of Solomon and the reliability of the biblical account. In the 1980s, the archaeologists I call the Modernists picked up on the puzzles presented by the biblical accounts of David and Solomon. They began to question the archaeology. They challenged the traditional account of the reigns of the 2 kings and the archaeology that seemed to support it. In the 1990s, one group argued that all of the finds that scholars assigned to the United Kingdom should be redated to a good century later, to the time of the Israelite house of Omri. I'll have a lot to say about the Omrids in later episodes. The most vocal exponent of this group is Israel Finkelstein, but there are many others with fewer marketing skills. To these archaeologists, the United Kingdom is a phantom. David and Solomon were no great kings ruling all the 12 tribes, but at best chieftains running the south. They built nothing. No palaces, no temple, no stables, no gates. Jerusalem was not a mighty metropolis, capital of a powerful kingdom, but a tiny unfortified town. And so, like the patriarchs, the two kings vanish into history. That idea upsets a lot of people. A lot of people. To many Jews and to many Christians, to challenge the biblical description of King David is to attack their religion and to deny the state of Israel's right to exist. Here is Daniel Polisar, the provost of Israel's answer to America's Ivy League universities, the Israeli Shalem College in Jerusalem. Quote, "Our claim to being one of the senior nations in the world, to being a real player in civilization's realm of ideas, is that we wrote the book of books, the Bible. You take David and his kingdom out of the book, and you have a different book. The narrative is no longer a historical work, but a work of fiction. And then the rest of the Bible is just a propagandistic effort to create something that never was. And if you can't find the evidence for it, then it probably didn't happen. That's why the stakes are so high." End quote. Israel Finkelstein has a different take. Quote, "When I'm doing research, I have to distinguish between the culture of David and the historical David. David is extremely important for my cultural identity. David for me is the David reflected in the later King Hezekiah, the David reflected in the later King Josiah, the David who is the connection with the beginning of Christianity. In this sense, David is everything. If you want me to say it simplistically, I'm proud that this nobody from nowhere became the centre of Western tradition. So for me, David is not a plaque on the wall, not even merely a leader of a 10th century band. No, he is much more than that." End quote. Let me frame the problem in the way that archaeologists would. The judges lived in the period called Iron Age 1. To archaeologists, the central question is, to what historical period can we assign the Iron Age 1-2 boundary? Is it the time of the United Kingdom under David and Solomon, or a century later, in the time of the House of Omri? Why the fuss? The period that archaeologists call Iron Age 2 in Palestine is a very different beast from Iron Age 1. For a start, this is the age in which a distinct Canaanite culture disappears. It morphs into the Israelites and Phoenicians and is absorbed by the Philistines. So from now on, I'll talk about Palestine rather than Canaan. Urban life returns in Iron Age 2. In episode 1.29, I mentioned that Iron Age 1 saw the foundation of dozens of new villages throughout Palestine, at first in Israel, then in Judah. One of the markers used to define the start of Iron Age 2 is the growth of these villages into towns. These towns were full of small houses that archaeologists call four-room houses, unique to the period. Some of the towns grew into modest cities, and a few even became fortified. These were cities whose like had not been seen since the Bronze Age collapse. For the first time in 200 years, you could find a decent nightclub just a week away by donkey. With urban life came social stratification. In Iron Age 1, pretty much everyone was a goat herder, a farmer, or a shepherd. In Iron Age 2, Some people became merchants, scribes, professional soldiers, bureaucrats, and large-scale landowners. Divisions emerged between town and country. Whole new social classes were imposed on the ancient agricultural bedrock. This is a very great change from the ideals of the tribal society depicted in the Book of Judges. International trade began to revive. We find this especially in the pottery. A type called red slipware or burnished ware became common, of much finer quality than the people of Iron Age 1 used. It seems to have been imported from Cyprus or Phoenicia. The architecture changed. The Israelites of the Judges had no tradition of urban planning or experience in building cities and temples and palaces. In Iron Age 2, we find the first substantial civic structures: gateways, fortifications, storerooms, walls. Much in what is called ashlar construction, squared and smoothed building stones. We also find changes in religious art and increasing signs of literacy. The inference from all this is that Iron 2 is the time in which organised states emerged in the Levant. States very different to the chiefdom of Saul. States that collected taxes, which could be used to pay for great buildings, to pay for standing armies, to employ scribes to keep accounts. And those scribes could produce substantial bodies of literature. We have no absolute time anchors that we can tie either the pottery or the buildings to. We have no clay tablet found in the dry earth saying that Pharaoh so-and-so or Assyrian king such-and-such passed by on vacation. I said in episode 1.6 that the whole dating edifice is held together with string and scotch tape. Here is one period and one place in which the string is snapping and the tape losing its stick. To the Traditionalists, the Iron 1-2 boundary is exactly where it should be, at the start of David's kingdom. If you want a technical term for it, this theory is called the high chronology. Iron 2 starts with David's conquest of the Philistines in about 1000 BC and his creation of a solid, centralised state. A key part of the traditional dating argument relies on accepting the veracity of the Bible's account of Solomon. The Bible says that Solomon built great structures at Megiddo, Hatzor, and Giza. So any structures we find there must be Solomon's. The pottery we find with those structures can then be used to date other sites to Solomon's reign. For more than a century, scholars believed that the job of Middle Eastern archaeology was to support the history told in the Bible. They asked only those questions and considered only those texts that they thought were relevant to the interpretation of biblical literature. Although an old study, dating back to the early 19th century, the field of Assyriology was wholly subservient to biblical studies. Events recorded in Assyrian and Babylonian sources that were not mentioned in the Bible were ignored. If an inscription was found describing an Assyrian attack on Israel's neighbour, the kingdom of Aram Damascus, even the Assyriologists yawned. But an inscription describing an Assyrian attack on Israel was greeted with pants-wetting excitement. No one was interested in producing an accessible archive of Middle Eastern documents apart from those that bore upon biblical studies. Until the 1980s, the only substantial collection of the Assyrian royal documents was a work published in the 1920s. All that has changed in the past 30 years. There are several major trends in current thought. First, scholars are paying much more attention to evidence from sources outside the Bible. Second, archaeologists have moved from trying to find the Ark of the Covenant to conducting much less romantic, wide-scale field studies. In the first half of the 20th century, it was all very Indiana Jones. Now, Indiana is calculating ancient population densities and analysing pollen counts. No one is going to make a movie about that. Third, and the biggest difference between the traditionalists and the New Wave, is to deny that the Bible has a privileged place as a historical source. In short, you cannot trust the Bible. That destroys the entire raison d'etre of biblical archaeology as it was practiced until 1990. The earliest modernists, like Philip Davies and Thomas Thompson in the 1970s, led the charge by denying that the Bible had anything of worth to say. The modernists were especially keen to deny the historical existence of David and Solomon. That position was blown out of the water by the discovery of the Tel Dan stele in 1993. This is an inscription by a king of Aram Damascus that describes the kingdom of Judah as the house of David. Nonetheless, their idea that the Bible is not a source for understanding Israelite history, but an ideological product of it, is still a tenet of modernist thinking. The later modernists, like Finkelstein, acknowledge that the biblical story is untrustworthy, but certainly accept that David and Solomon were real people. Finkelstein's theory is known as the low chronology. It proposes that the Iron 1-2 boundary should be set at about 900 BC, well after the death of Solomon and just before the house of Omri. Between the dates proposed by the high and low chronologies, there is but a century difference. That is small beer in archaeological terms. But that is the century assigned to the United Monarchy. If the low chronology is correct, the first great state of the Hebrews was the northern kingdom of the Omrids, not the southern kingdom of David and Solomon. All the great buildings assigned to Solomon must then be reassigned to the Omrids. The modernists have some circumstantial evidence in their favour, but it is not conclusive. The non-biblical sources show that all the small kingdoms of the Levant, Aram Damascus, Ammon, Moab, Edom, were created as a response to the westward march of the Assyrians from 900 BC on. The emergence of the Omrid kingdom of northern Israel fits that pattern perfectly. The creation of a territorial state by David a century earlier does not. A subplot running parallel to the chronological debate concerns the origins of the biblical text. Everyone accepts a long oral tradition, but when did the scribes actually start recording this on papyrus and parchment? The traditionalists assign a very early date, sometime in the United Kingdom. The early modernists argue that the text was written very late, well after the exile in Persian and Hellenistic times. Pretty much everything was a historical fantasy. The scribes wrote their fictions and created a mythic past to justify to the community in exile why the returnees deserved to occupy the land of Palestine. Current modernist thinking is to deny that the United Kingdom had a scribal culture sophisticated enough to create any sort of significant literature. This thinking follows the documentary hypothesis that I talked about in episode 1.7, and the theory of the Deuteronomistic historian that I introduced in episode 1.23. It places the biblical scribes in the late monarchic period, after 700 BC, a full 3 centuries after David. The modernists have certainly triggered a massive counter-reaction. Now I hope I get the following names right. The archaeologists Eliot Mazar and Yossi Garfinkel are their most determined opponents. They date a substantial construction in Jerusalem called the stepped stone structure to the time of David. They believe it to be the remnants of David's palace. They argue that finds of buildings and inscriptions at a place called Kirbet Kiyafa, 30 kilometres southwest of Jerusalem, can be dated to David's time. These, they say, prove that the United Kingdom really was an advanced state. They point to a calendar found at Giza. They also point to a boulder from the Shephelah, the region east of Jerusalem, that was later reused as a building stone. It contains an early form of the Hebrew alphabet, an abecedary. From this they argue that the United Kingdom also had an erudite scribal culture. I am in no position, believe me, to arbitrate between the contenders. But one thing that has struck me is that from small acorns do all archaeologists grow great oak trees. An annoying complication is introduced by artefacts that some say are authentic and others denounce as forgeries, depending on their predilections. If you Google ivory pomegranate, you can find out what I mean. For example, the dating of Khirbet Qiyyafa depends on the radiocarbon measurements of just 4 olive pits. Now that's not 4 holes full of ancient olives, but the seeds from precisely 4 olives. The inscription on the Shephelah stone is a few scrawls of graffiti. Finkelstein and other modernists also rely on scrappy evidence. The best evidence in Finkelstein's favour is that the radiocarbon dating generally favours his position. Where we can get good dates, they seem to show that structures once assigned to the United Kingdom should be redated to much later. But of course, there are considerable margins of error, margins that could be taken as consistent with either the high or low chronologies. Another point in Finkelstein's favour is that even many traditionalist archaeologists have abandoned the old high chronology in favour of what they call the modified conventional chronology, or middle chronology. As you would think, that fits halfway between the high and low chronologies. It is a shift of a tiny 50 years, but it saves the United Kingdom from oblivion. I'm with Finkelstein on this one, but what do I know? In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I begin the exciting stories of the 2 kingdoms of Judah and Israel, the successors to the United Kingdom of David and Solomon. I'll see you then.